The U.S. President Joe Biden has invited 40 world leaders to attend a leaders' summit on climate, calling for a stronger climate action globally. With Chinese President Xi Jinping on the invitation list, the world is expecting a rare collaboration between the two nations. Will the collaboration be guaranteed? How confident is the U.S. to re-engage in its commitment on climate change efforts? And how will the world major economies be in sync with the U.S. and China? Joining me today from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia is Thye, research professor at Jeffrey Sachs Center for Sustainable Development, and from Pusan, the Republic of Korea, is Professor Robert Kelly of the Department of Political Science at Pusan National University. Welcome to The Point, gentlemen. Professor Kelly, let me go to you first. Now, 40 world leaders are expected to attend an online summit on climate this week, hosted by U.S. President Joe Biden. The foremost goal of this event is said to be galvanizing efforts by the world's major economies to reduce emissions during this critical decade, to keep a limit to warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. That's according to the White House. What does this summit signify, and how will it impact on the global climate change efforts, especially among those world major economies?
Yeah, I think this is an important part of the Biden message, the part that helped him get elected. The environment is pretty important to the American left, particularly the younger cohort of voters that Biden courted to help put him over the top with Trump. Obviously, climate change is also a really major global issue now, right? I mean, I'll leave it to the technical people, but I mean, the information that's coming from the scientific community is that, we're actually looking at something pretty serious and pretty disastrous, possibly even within the next several decades, maybe 5 to 10 decades or something like that. And if that's really true, then we have to act sooner. I mean, this is sort of the classic problem with climate change, right? I mean, by the time the changes become really felt, it'll be too difficult to reverse them. So we need to act now, and it's very difficult to galvanize movement at an early stage. And so I applaud Biden for trying to do this. I think that it's really good actually try to get China and the United States to work on something together. Maybe if this will work, then we can actually work on tougher, thorny issues like the South China Sea or North Korea. But China and the United States are the two biggest economies now in the world. If anybody's going to work on climate change, it's got to be the two of them, right? And maybe India and a few other ones of the big ones. But really, the U.S. and China really need to come to some kind of terms on this if we're going to move on it.
Thye, it was the U.S., however, which retreated from the Paris Agreement a couple of years ago. Now they're coming back. How much confidence do you think the world can have in the U.S.'s permanent commitment to the Paris Agreement and further actions to tackle climate crisis?
Well, it is the return of the United States to the Paris Climate Treaty is also a return to rationality, a return to finally, again, taking into account the enlightened self-interest of the United States. For the statement to say that the summit is to galvanize the world is an overstatement. And polite talk, we would say it is to help to galvanize the world. And in reality, it is to finally catch up with what the other big economies are doing. In September 2019, the European Union, which is as big as the United States, committed to carbon neutrality. October 2020, China committed to carbon neutrality by 2060, and within a few weeks, Japan and Korea followed. So this is more the U.S. trying to become a player in the global effort to decarbonize the economies, to address an existential threat that is so clear to all, but the most irrational, unstable genius like Donald Trump.
Well, Chinese President Xi Jinping is on the invitation list, and he is implied that it is implied that he will attend the summit, as Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Liu Yicheng hinted over the weekend that China will accept the invitation, and President Xi is likely it will bring a message of activeness, cooperation, excuse me, and responsibility to the meeting. Professor Kelly, your understanding, why do you think China has accepted this invitation, given the heated rhetoric in bilateral relations? And why do you think President Biden reached out in the first place?
Yeah, well, I think the most obvious reason, I think, for everybody right, beyond sort of the Trumpists that Dr. Wu mentioned, is that this is in fact the enlightened self-interest. This is in the enlightened self-interest, if you will, of basically everybody on the planet, right? I mean, again, sort of the threat is, the language coming from the scientific community has gotten significantly more dire on climate change in the last 10 years. And I think ultimately that's going to drive a lot of states towards some kind of agreement on this, because, I mean, this thing is coming and there's really not much that we can do about it if we don't have significant global collaboration. I think the Biden people recognize that in a way that the Trump people just didn't want to, right? I mean, in the United States, climate change has become a highly partisan issue. We can talk about that if you want. But the Biden people, I think, sort of understand at least the basic science of it, and understand that without China and some of the other large economies we talked about, without them on board, there's just not going to be much progress. And this is something where the United States and China both have an interest, right? I mean, even if the U.S. and China, even if we compete on like North Korea or the South China Sea and stuff like that, none of that's going to make any difference if everything is flooded in 75 years, right? So I think that the cause, the sort of purpose for the two sides to collaborate, actually, I think is pretty clear. And I think it should actually be rather easy to sideline the geopolitical issues, because the larger environmental issues just don't care. I mean, the environment just doesn't care about China's behavior in Hong Kong or America and South China Sea. It just doesn't care.
Yeah. Well, the situation, however, is quite complicated. For instance, Japan announced on April the 12th that the Japanese government has decided to discharge more than 1 million tons of wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear power plant accident into the sea. The announcement said Japan has weighed the options and effects. Following that, the U.S. State Department kind of tacitly endorses the idea, saying Japan has been transparent and that it appears to have done so in accordance with globally accepted nuclear safety standards. However, UN experts have expressed deep dissatisfaction or disappointment over the decision. Both the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, and the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, and the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment have issued a joint statement saying the move imposes considerable risks to the full enjoyment of human rights of concerned populations in and beyond the borders of Japan. Now, Win-Tie Wu, as the world gathers to talk about how to protect the environment, what message do you think the U.S. has sent to the world as a convener of such a summit?
I think first let's talk about the U.S. support for Japan. This is a case of collaboration that is really akin to the collaboration between U.S. and China on climate change. In a multipolar world, there will always be competition and collaboration. It is important to have the collaboration in order to prevent the competition from straying into more dangerous areas. We can have competition in economy that is normal. We can have competition in the space race that is normal, but we don't want to have a spillover into competition of expanding geographical influence. We have to collaborate when we are taking matters of low risk, or when we are trying to reduce climate change to a low risk possibility.
Professor Kelly, what is your take on the same question?
Yeah, I think the technical issues are such now that I'm not sure that Japan could really continue to store this water, right? I think that's sort of the big issue that I'm sort of hearing from Japanese colleagues, right? Is that what do we do with this water if we don't flush it? How long do we store this? How many more tanks are we supposed to build? And are we still going to be storing stuff in 20 or 30 years? I think ultimately that's really sort of the technical limit here, right? I mean, what do we expect the Japanese to do with this water if they don't eject it at some point? I think, as neighboring states, China and Korea have sort of real interests, obviously, particularly in the fishing industry, right? This is something that I've often sort of talked about with like Western news audiences that don't understand that sort of seafood is a much greater part of Asian diets than it is in the West. So I think this is a bit more of an issue here culturally than it might be in the West, where this is sort of, I think, not perceived with the same kind of dire sense of urgency. But, so I share those concerns. I live in South Korea myself, but again, I'm just not sure technically what's left for the Japanese to do. It would have been nice if they could have consulted more with the South Koreans and the Chinese, gotten some kind of local buy-in. And I think it's a shame that it's kind of gotten politicized by the participation of the United States. But I'm just not sure what's left for the Japanese to do. It's been 10 years. What are they going to do now?
there is a certain level of risk, of course, and for Japan, they also has to find a way to eventually get rid of these water. But as we have seen from the UN experts, and I named three of them, they are not talking about just a small risk of violation to the rights of the people in this area. They're talking about considerable risks, and there are people from the toxics area, from area of food, from area of environment, and they issued this joint statement. Don't you think that their opinion also deserves a bit more attention? Professor Mr. Win first.
Well, one thing is this process will start in 2 years from now, which means that there's still time to halt it if evidence comes in suggesting that it is still too dangerous. Second, the dispersion of water will be spread out over 30 years. So we are not talking about one gigantic lump going in. The authority on atomic waste is the International Atomic Energy Commission. So this is why I gave it the greatest weight in weighing the different opinions that come in.
Professor Kelly, do you think we can absolutely trust the apolitical nature of all of the international organizations? Because sometimes you simply cannot trust it.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of a large issue across many of the specialized agencies of the United Nations. Again, the technical issues on this are beyond me, I have to admit. But again, I think the limit in Japan for how much more of this it can store really is sort of the ultimate issue here, right? And as long as it's discharged over time and it's monitored, again, I'm not sure what better compromise solution there is. But the Japanese should have gone to the Koreans and the Chinese and worked on this earlier. I certainly agree with that. I mean, to your question of politicality, it would have been nice if there were greater consultation and this hadn't sort of been sprung on the neighbors.
Yeah, before we go, let's come back still to this climate summit that's going to be held. I mean, right before President Xi is expected to attend the summit that the U.S. is hosting, he actually attended a virtual summit with leaders of France and Japan on the 16th of April. Professor Kelly, how do you look at the significance of that meeting vis-a-vis the global summit that the U.S. is hosting? Why does the Chinese needed to meet the European leaders first, in your eyes?
Sure. I think, the background to all of this, right, is sort of the rising competition between the United States and China, right? And one of the best things that we can do to sort of tamp that down, I think would be a disaster for all of us if the United States and China slide into a Cold War. But one of the best things we can do is actually cooperate on apolitical and technical issues like climate change, things that can be somewhat depoliticized. And it's actually good if we get other partners involved too, right? And to the extent that these issues exceed both the Americans and the Chinese, and it's not cast in zero-sum terms, right, about sort of like borders and things like that, right? If we can bring in other partners, then that helps to sort of expand the discussion.
Many thanks to my two guests, Professor Thye from Jeffrey Sachs Center for Sustainable Development and Professor Robert Kelly from the Pusan National University in the Republic of Korea.